Welcome to Sunday School at Second Baptist Church. I'm glad you're able to be with me this morning. We're working this quarter through the book of Proverbs and the sayings of King Solomon that God led him to say, to teach the people, to teach his sons, and to teach us as well. And so today we're going to be in chapter 14 of the book of Proverbs. And it's, we're into the section now where there are instructions on many things, and it's impossible really to go verse by verse through these chapters because there's so much information there. There's a lot of knowledge in the book of Proverbs, and it's a good study to do day by day, or as you have time to read through and to think about each verse individually or together with others around it. Because there's so many things that can guide our lives in the way that we conduct ourselves. Solomon had the wisdom of God, and we have the benefit of having these things written down for us to look at. And so in chapter 14, we're going to focus on a certain number of verses in the chapter. And if you have the student book, if you have access to that, and it is available at the church if you come by the church anytime, it says, I'm on page 65 in the student book when I'm talking about this particular thing. Solomon used something in chapter 14 which is called a chiasmus, which I'd never heard that word before, but a chiasmus is where the verses that he used, and it's sometimes used in poetry, and I recognize that I've probably read poems that had this, but it's where like the first verse and the last verse are related, then the second and the next to last are related, and then the third and the next one, and then finally the middle. And in this case, the middle verses are the point of what he was saying in this section. So that's a little bit different. But so what the lesson is doing then is it's taking the first and last verse together, the second and the next to last verse together, and we're going to consider each section that way. So that'll be a little bit different today. So let's look first at verse 8 and verse 15. I'm going to read those out of the student book, and then I'm going to go and read those out of my Bible as well. The version of the Bible that I use week by week is the New American Standard, and I like it. I asked someone one time that was a biblical scholar that I respected a lot, which version that do you really enjoy and seems to be translated well from the original scriptures and all that. And this is the one that he enjoyed, and it's a little bit more modern language, but in many ways it's similar to the King James. So let's read it in both places. So I'm going to read Proverbs chapter 14, verse 8 and 15, first out of the student book. Verse 8, the sensible person's wisdom is to consider his way, but the stupidity of fools deceives them. And then verse 15, the inexperienced one believes anything, but the sensible one watches his steps. When I was growing up, we would have not ever, it would have been looked badly on, I guess you might say, to call someone stupid. Nowadays you hear that all the time, but it was not polite to do something like that, and we would have never said the word fool, because we, also in the Bible it says don't call anyone a fool, over in Matthew. And so that whole verse, it is what it is, but it makes me feel uncomfortable to read it even now because of the way that I was brought up. But let's look in my version now. Proverbs chapter 14 and verse 8. The wisdom of the sensible is to understand his way, but the foolishness of fools is deceit. And then in verse 15 it says, the naive believes everything, but the sensible man considers his steps. And so these two verses you can kind of see, if you take time to look at both of them in your Bible, that they're related in a way, because both of them are talking about considering your steps and how it's foolish not to consider your steps, how it's wisdom to consider your way or your path or your steps. And it says in verse 15, the naive person believes anything. Another word for that is being gullible, I guess. But the sensible person considers his steps. So Solomon again is talking about being guided by God's wisdom and taking the time to consider the steps that we take, and not just naively following whatever whim comes along. I think that's so important all the time, but especially in the days that we're in, where anyone can publish anything in the newspaper or on the internet, on Facebook, and all these different venues. They can put it on TV. If you watch one newscast, they make it so slanted in their direction, and if you watch another newscast, they make it so slanted in their direction that if you were a naive person and you listen to these things, you could say, oh wow, this or that, and be led down a path that was not really correct. And so it's important for us as Christian people who are trying to follow the wisdom of God that we consider very carefully the path that we're following, whether it is right, and especially for those in leadership positions who may be a pastor. I'm not speaking about our pastor, but a pastor or a Sunday school teacher, a city leader, a councilman, or whoever that is a leader of people. Then those people especially have a burden to make wise decisions, because they not only are answerable for themselves, but in a way they are answerable for those people who make decisions based on what they have promoted, I guess you might say. And so, we have the issue of wear the mask or don't wear the mask, and authorities who say wear it and authorities who say don't wear it, and all of those things going on in our society. And we have other things like that. Open the schools, don't open the schools. We have those things going on right now daily and very intensely. And so each person in a leadership position has to be very carefully considering the decisions that they make these days. Okay, let's go on to the next little section. So this is going to go to verse 9 and verse 14. Now we're getting closer to the middle. Let's read verse 9 and 14 out of both versions. So in the student book it says, verse 9, fools mock at making reparation, but there is goodwill among the upright. And then verse 14, the disloyal one will get what his conduct deserves, and a good one what his deeds deserve. Now out of this version, verse 9 says, fools mock at sin, but among the upright there is goodwill. And in verse 14, it says, the backslider in heart will have his fill of his own ways, but a good man will be satisfied with his. Okay, so let's break those two down. The first verse talks about making reparation in the student version, and in my version it says fools mock at sin, or another interpretation of that is fools mock at guilt. And this kind of refers back to the ideas from the book of Leviticus, which is the book of the law, Leviticus, where they wrote down the laws that governed the nation of Israel and the sacrifices that should be made and things like that. And there was a guilt offering for a person who had done wrong, whether you did wrong on purpose or unintentionally. You went and you offered a guilt offering to, ask God to forgive you for the thing that you had done. And that's the idea of making reparation. And also then the second part of that is that they were also instructed, and you can see this in Leviticus chapter 5 and on through there, you can read that. But they were also instructed to go and pay back the person that they had wronged if they had done something wrong, which is, similar to laws that we might have here in America, where a person who has done a wrong thing is fined or made to pay back to the person who has been wronged. And so what this verse is saying is that a foolish person is going to mock at making reparation or at admitting their guilt or whatever. And we see that all the time, where a person who has done something wrong, and then they they get a lawyer and say, oh no, he didn't do it, or they'll just simply lie about it and say they didn't, or even if they admit that they did, they're not going to do anything about it. They just pass it off like it was nothing, and we should not be concerned either. And we see that on TV, but we also see it in real life day by day as we run across people that are rude and say the wrong thing or do the wrong thing. And so it says the upright person has goodwill and is willing to make amends. In this, the idea of goodwill is the favor of God. So in other words, they are favored by God because of their willingness to have the right attitude, towards their guilt. I guess we might say it that way. And then the second part of that, which is verse 14, we get over to what my version says: the backslider in heart will have his fill of his own ways. The verse that came to my mind when I read that was over in Galatians, and I want to skip over and read that. Galatians chapter 6 and verse 7 is a very familiar verse for us, and it says, Galatians 6 verse 7, do not be deceived, God is not mocked, for whatever a man sows, this he will also reap. And we hear that, you reap what you sow. That's a common phrase that gets used. But this goes a little bit further, and I liked it because it says, do not be deceived, God is not mocked. And we were just talking about a person who mocks or scoffs at God, in the idea of making reparation. And this verse in the New Testament there tells us, God's not mocked. In other words, you may mock at God or scoff at God, but you won't get away with it. I mean, he knows that you've done that. He's not one to be toyed with, I guess you might say. And it says that the backslider will have his fill of his own ways, or in the student book it said he will get what his conduct deserves. And so, again, you reap what you sow. If you are constantly bullying people as you go through life, then you may be surprised or not that people then begin to return that back to you in the way that they treat you. And that's a small example. There are other things that are much more serious, but something like bullying or being pushy, those are things that we should be able to relate to, because we have to be very careful that that our personality doesn't change in these stressful times that we're living in, and that we don't begin to say or do things in a way that is not characteristic for us. We might, it's easy to live a nice Christian life when you're not under stress. But when you get under stress, and the circumstances of life are pushing down on you, that's when the crazy comes out. So it's something for us to think about, very, very much so. And then it says the backslider in heart. It refers to them as the backslider. So in other words, a person who followed God and maybe was on the path of following God and close to God, and then for whatever reason they have turned and gone in a different direction, then this verse is saying that person is going to have his fill of his own ways, or the ways that he's chosen are going to be what he becomes filled up with in a way. So I thought about Matthew chapter 5 and verse 23 and 24. I wanted to read those verses because Jesus referred to something that I think is related and along the same line, talking about the guilt offering and things like that. In Matthew chapter 5 verses 23 and 24, Jesus was talking about relationships, and he says, therefore, and you can go and read the previous verses, but he says, therefore, if you're presenting your offering at the altar, and there remember that your brother has something against you, leave your offering there before the altar and go. First be reconciled to your brother, and then come and present your offering. So, this was a reminder from Jesus that, when you're bringing that offering, be sure that you've also made reparations to your brother that you may have offended by the thing that you've done. Yes, it's important to ask God's forgiveness. That's the most important thing. But secondly, we should also ask forgiveness of our brother if we have offended them in some way. So the next two verses is verse 10 and verse 13. Let's read those. In the student book, it says, the heart knows its own bitterness, and no outsider shares in its joy. And in verse 13, it says, even in laughter, a heart may be sad, and joy may end in grief. And this, reading it then from my version, in verse 10, it says, the heart knows its own bitterness, and a stranger does not share its joy. That's almost exactly the same. And then in verse 13, even in laughter, the heart may be in pain, and the end of joy may be grief. And so, this section here, we were talking about how a person might put on a happy face and pretend that there's nothing at all wrong, but deep down inside their heart is full of grief or sadness. And we as Christians, we really, maybe we take a different approach if we can to that, and not to hide the fact that we're grieving, and to hide that from our fellow believers, but to share that burden together with them, so that they pray for us and they give us encouragement. For our the end of grief, because grief comes to all of us at some point over something. But the end of grief can be joy for the Christian if we allow God's wisdom, to lead us through the grief. And so hiding your grief is not really the answer. And also the second part of this, I think, is to think about another person. I saw something this week that said, if a parent has decided to send their children back to school, you don't know their story. If a person has decided to keep their children at home, you don't know their story. So the point of that was, and it's the same point for this, when you meet a person, you don't really know their story unless you take some time to get to know them, and know that the first thing you see out of them may be a happy face, but deep down inside they have some burdens that it would be great if you could share that with them and help them and encourage them. Okay, let's go to the last part now, is the point of this little section, and that is verse 11 and 12. So I'm going to read those out of both versions. Proverbs 14:11 and 12. The house of the wicked will be destroyed, but the tent of the upright will flourish. There is a way that seems right to a person, but its end is the way to death. And then in my version is similar. The house of the wicked will be destroyed, but the tent of the upright will flourish. There is a way which seems right to a man, but its end is the way of death. So, we have thought about these things many times in the past, how this verse says, there is a way that seems right. And when you're making a big decision, it's daunting to think about that. There may be a way that just seems right to you, that you should do that, but then the end result of it is death or destruction or a really bad consequence, And so we pray as we make a big decision that we are following God's will and not just our own will, in any decision that we make, because truly we can choose something and we can think it's just so right, and then it really isn't. One thing that when Clint and I were first married, we were young when we got married. I was 18 and he was 20. So we've been married for a very long time. But when we were first married, one of us would convince the other on something, or vice versa. The other one would convince that one, and we would say, why don't we do this? And we, talk it up, and then the other one says, yeah, okay, let's do that. In our decision making about life and where we would go or where we would live or whatever, we kind of did it that way. And at some point, thank God, we figured out that if we would not make a big decision unless we agreed on it and knowing that God was guiding us, then it would be better. And sure enough, the rest of life has been so much better because we did that. And I'm thankful for being married and having that other person who also follows God, because together, as we make a decision and we have God's input through both of us, I guess you might say, then we're guided more often to make the right decision. Are all our decisions right? No. But we found a lot more success or felt a lot better about the decisions that happened. So, it's important. Don't take just your own opinion. If you just take your own opinion on what you should do in life, then you're always going to agree with yourself. Isn't that right? But it might not be God's will for you to take the decision that you have taken. And another part of these verses here, it says, the house of the wicked will be destroyed, but the tent of the upright will flourish. I thought that was an interesting part, because it talks about the house of the wicked, like he has a house, a built house that's, more sturdy and everything. He's put a lot into this and everything, but that house is going to be destroyed, it says. but the tent of the upright. So in other words, even though the upright is there living in a temporary dwelling and doesn't have the resources that the wicked person has, but his tent is going to flourish in spite of the fact that he might be living on meager means or whatever. So I thought that was a good way to put it. And we truly are sometimes in poverty of spirit. I think there's a verse in the Bible that refers to it that way. When we are under stress and things happen in life that are difficult, we might come to God with poverty of spirit. But even in poverty of spirit, God will guide us and cause us to flourish from our situation of poverty. And it might be poverty of material possessions as well, but God will cause us to make it through. He will help us through that. And so it's important for us to think about those things. Now, there are other parts to this chapter that I didn't cover today, and I won't have time to do that. But going on from these verses on to the end of the chapter, there are quite a few verses that refer to the quick-tempered person. And, I think it's good to read on through the rest of the chapter because certainly we encounter quick-tempered people on a daily basis. And we might be one of those. And like I said, with the stress of all the things that are going on lately, it brings out those emotions in some of us that might normally we can keep those under wraps. And so it's good to read through the rest of this chapter when you have an opportunity and just read about the quick-tempered person. Be sure that you're not becoming that person. Thank you for joining me today. I appreciate you very much. I appreciate you going through the study of the Proverbs as we've done this together. It's interesting, and I think it's a timely study that we're doing, talking about all of these emotions and things that we've talked about week by week. So I hope you'll join me next time when we have Sunday school again together. God bless.